So let's talk about bureaucracy. Yeah, I know it's a really exciting topic. It's not one of those topics a whole lot of people like to discuss because it's kind of like the name itself. It's kind of tied down in the mundane to where it's really kind of hard to get through because there's just so much nuance to it and there's nothing exciting about it. And so because of that, people have a tendency of kind of avoiding ever discussing it in the first place. But here's the problem with that is in order to understand your government, you have to actually understand bureaucracy because without bureaucracy, nothing would get done. Because we're huge. Our country is huge. Most countries are huge. And so because of that, we don't have the luxury of relying on just a few people to kind of get things done. You have to have an entire infrastructure in order to make things actually happen. And so going back to one of the original free thinkers on the idea of bureaucracy, Max Weber, looks like the name Weber, it's a German name. So basically his idea was, or his concept of bureaucracy was this was important and pretty much all organizations are literally tied to it. And without bureaucracy, you're literally not going to get anything done. So he sees it as a positive aspect to the way things can actually get done as opposed to kind of nothing ever getting done because there's just too many people involved in trying to do things. And if there's no collaboration between them, which is what the bureaucracy is, then nothing's ever going to get done. So bureaucracy kind of rules by the idea of using specialists. So instead of just hiring somebody and saying, yeah, go do it because we need someone to fill that position, it's usually somebody who's actually done work to make sure that he or she is the right person for that position. And so that happens over time, and you end up hiring people on what's called a meritocracy, which is the better they are at their actual job, the higher up they go into the system or continue on into the system. And so each department that you have has what's called a SOP, or a standard operating procedure, meaning that if all of the main people in charge left tomorrow, somebody else could grab this document and say, this is exactly what we're supposed to do, and understand it, and not just kind of have to reinvent the wheel over and over again. So a couple of things happened in our history that have changed things. Like I said, we've gotten bigger. And we started relying more on meritocracy rather than the idea of just giving somebody a job because they were your friend. And so over the years, we added more and more layers of this bureaucracy. And so I don't know if you're familiar with the name Kafka. And so quite often when people are talking about bureaucracy, if you're looking at the opposite of it, or the negatives of it, or how it kind of gets out of control, Kafka is the idea of too much bureaucracy, to where it's so bureaucratic, nothing gets done. So sometimes you run into that, and that's why you do have standard operating procedures, because without them, it's really, really hard to actually get things done. So part of since about the 1920s, there's been a desire to kind of like cut back on some of government while still instituting or maintaining a lot of the stuff that is necessary in order to get things done. And so in the 1980s, President Reagan he actually instituted a whole bunch of procedures that streamline this even further. And so the idea was to move a lot of government functions out of government to more private entities, which would then serve as the bureaucracy. So they wouldn't not get things done. They would just have new people doing it, and there would be more of a profit generated into the process of doing it. And so basically, it's kind of how our government has evolved since then. So the idea has been for the last couple 50 years or so, is to cut back on government. But unfortunately, it's really difficult to do when you have more and more people in the country, because more and more people in the country require more and more people in government in order to take care of all the needs that they have. So our bureaucracy in the United States, at least, is mostly the defense budget. So it actually, well, not mostly, it's literally 1/4 of the entire budget, but that's a lot of money going into one agency or one group. And so it's different agencies within the Defense Department. There's a new one very recently, but these agencies all work hand in hand together, and so they have to set up a hierarchical structure to make things get done. And so you'll have, like, your Joint Chiefs of Staff, then you'll have like Department of the Army, Department of the Navy, these different ones. So this little top-down kind of process is how the bureaucracy works. So somebody's always reporting to somebody else. So a lot of the funding that goes into our government goes into all sorts of different programs. And these are all, the money comes from, well, not comes from, the money is approved by Congress that actually allocates spending, then gets doled out to the different agencies that actually need to do the things that they do. Well, for the sake at least of our bureaucracy, covering the federal bureaucracy, is we're going to talk mostly about the executive department, because the executive department is kind of like the one that we have the most direct contact to, and it literally is the one that ties mostly to the people. Whereas you have bureaucracy built into the Supreme Court system, or the court systems. You have bureaucracy also built into the congressional system, but they're kind of their own top-down process, and we could get into that in detail, but that too would take quite a bit of work. So let's focus mainly on the executive department, and understand that all other bureaucracies have similar kinds of structures, but may have just some different names. Our executive department actually has 15 major executive departments. And that can range based on whether or not the president decides to add or remove some part of the cabinet that he has during his government. And so Trump has done a couple of changes on there, still kind of maintaining the same number of them, but kind of lessening the number of people in specific agencies. So whether or not it's a good or a bad thing, we still haven't gotten to the point of actually having enough time to look back on it. So we'll find that as we kind of go forward. But each one of these executive departments, and that's what's important here, has its own responsibility. And so it's whatever policy area that it's dealing with, like the EPA deals with, environmental protection agencies. So it's that type of legislation. So any of the legislation that got passed by Congress, they're the ones that enforce it. And so each one of these departments, like the Justice Department, its concept is to actually make sure that justice is served to the people. Law enforcement has its own functions. Homeland Security has its functions. So whatever those functions are, that's literally what they spend the majority of their time actually doing. So let's talk about a typical departmental structure. So each cabinet department consists of the department's top administrators, plus a number of agencies that fall under that particular administrator. And so each department generally follows a kind of a typical bureaucratic structure. They may have a little bit of nuance here and there, but for the most part, they're following pretty much the same concept. Like one that's been around for pretty much forever is the Department of Agriculture. It's very similar to what a lot of the other agencies are in the country, but its functions are obviously completely different and deal mostly with the ideas of agriculture. And so it's, again, it's usually a top-down process of somebody in charge, and then they branch off into the different functions underneath it, and then those functions branch off into even further more. So that way you have someone who's got an accountability at the very end, the first people on top, but you also have all of the, you know, the workers out there actually doing the things that they actually need to do. And whatever, like I said, their function could be whatever their mandate is for their particular organization. So quite often, the creation of a bureaucracy is because there's some kind of idea or some kind of problem that needed to be solved. Congress decides, let's solve this problem, or the president decides, let's solve this problem by creating an agency. And then the rest of the time is spent building the infrastructure on that. Like I mentioned, they'll create a SOP to make sure things are getting done. And so, and the idea is, as long as they keep getting funded, they keep doing the job that they actually do. Part of the problem with that is sometimes government doesn't want to stay behind it, doesn't like some of the things they're actually doing, and so may end up not funding them. So basically their agency kind of goes defunct. And when that happens, they really have no future. And so they kind of get absorbed back into the main system, or just kind of dropped off on the side of the road and left there to wither and die. That's really a bad way to put it, but you get the idea. And so in 1883, talk about the merit system, we had it was called the Civil Service Reform Act. And the idea was to keep the whole idea of cronyism out of government. And so it was really popular at the time because you started getting better people in government rather than just people who knew people, which is really important. And so today, over 90% of our federal civil service is basically they're recruited on the basis of merit. And that's kind of how they keep their jobs. Now, in the old days, we had what was called the guild system, which was people would actually get their jobs by training with somebody, and then that person would then become the expert in that field and then train somebody else. And so in order to get into the field, you pretty much had to, you know, influence somebody to become part of the structure, or you were constantly on the outside, never able to actually get in. So when you create an agency, first thing they do is they work on the rulemaking and adjudication, kind of how things will actually get done. And then they start talking about the power of the regulatory agencies in order to utilize the power that they need to do in order to get things done. Yeah, pretty simple as that. There's rulemaking, such as requirements for making rules, because you can't just have people literally just kind of doing their own thing and just kind of figuring it out as they go along. So that's part of why we have the SOP system, which is when you have very set ways of creating government functions, then you make sure that it's consistent and kind of follows the same rules kind of going forward. So we have what's, I mean, part of the process of creating the whole bureaucratic structure is it's often referred to as, is it like a fourth branch of government, or are the regulatory agencies themselves the fourth branch of government? And which is interesting because they keep talking about fourth branches of government, and there's all sorts of different theories on fourth branches, like the media is often considered one. But regulatory agencies, they may be considered a fourth branch of government, but remember, they're working under the executive department for the most part, unless they're a congressional committee underneath it, and then obviously it's working under there. So they're not really a fourth branch, so they're kind of their own third branch. So let's talk about a concept that you're going to need to definitely know, and it's called an iron triangle. And so this is kind of how the whole process of a bureaucracy works, at least in our system. And it starts with them, like I said, it's a triangle. So you have congressional committees, you have executive agencies, like we've talked about, and then interest groups, because the interest groups are going to try to influence these executive agencies to get the things that they actually want done. And remember, those congressional committees are the ones that are kind of doing the oversight on these executive agencies, or at least historically they have. It hasn't been a lot recently because we have divided government. When you have divided government, that tends not to happen as much as it used to. And so a couple of sidebars to kind of keep in mind when you're talking about bureaucracy. One is called whistleblowers. And historically, the idea was if somebody had information about how things weren't working properly or the way the system could work better, you wanted to give them some protection coming forward so they didn't get fired, so you didn't end up like, shooting the messenger, which is the old phrase. And so there was, in 1989, we had the Whistleblowers Protection Act, which was designed to protect whistleblowers. We've had some problems very recently during the Trump administration and the impeachment whole thing, and recently whistleblower ended up getting the person in charge of the agency that reported the whole information fired. So there's a whole bunch of pushback going on that. It kind of depends on how the legal system and the Supreme Court looks at it, or if they do look at it to see if anything's done further, because there's a very good, strong chance that the Whistleblower Protection Act of 1989 might be somewhat defunct, because if nobody acts on it, to defend it, then basically it's just a piece of paper that doesn't mean anything. So one of the problems whistleblowers always have had anyway is the idea of retaliation. And it's not supposed to happen, and that's what the act was supposed to actually save them from. But one of the problems is sometimes you don't know if somebody's actually acting against you, and so there's a lot of backroom deals kind of things that is not supposed to happen in a government, especially in a free government. But it's happened, and it's caused all sorts of problems kind of going forward. There was an update to the Whistleblowers Act in 1997. It was called the Government Performance and Results Act, which is basically supposed to get better efficiency and better results. And so it was kind of a sidebar to it, but it wasn't really directly affecting the Whistleblower Act, Protection Act. The other thing is the government has started to move towards, it's called pay for performance plans. And the idea is trying to get things done for better results from not just government, but if somebody does really good work, or a program comes along that seems like it could be really beneficial, but the only way to get people to actually do it is to like put some money into it in order to make it happen. So like sometimes you'll have like, Silicon Valley people who are really, really good at doing specific things, but there's no way in the world they're going to work for the government because it's just not worth the money to them. So sometimes they'll incorporate pay for performance plans in order to kind of get that sort of thing done. A good example of this in our government was the US Postal Service. They added a program that was supposed to add bonuses for performances. It kind of worked and it hasn't worked, but one of the problems with anything dealing with the Postal Service is quite often government does everything physically possible to stop funding the Postal Service. And so whenever that happens, a lot of those incentives get killed off immediately, or at least die away really, really fast. So one of the other approaches I mentioned, which happened during the 1980s with the Ronald Reagan administration, was the idea of privatization. And so that's to move things more towards the private agencies or private, not government, basically, and to have them doing a lot of the functions of what we needed. One of the ideas was with like the Postal Service was to move things over to UPS or THS or one of these other companies, and try to get them to actually take over a lot of the functions of the Postal Department. Well, never happened because the Postal Department fought back hard because they have lobbyists, and those lobbyists managed to make sure that didn't happen. So whether it's a good or a bad thing is a completely different story. But those are some of the things that kind of happen when you're trying to move towards privatization. There's quite often resistance to make sure that it doesn't actually happen by people who have an incentive to make sure it continues happening the way things have been happening. So a couple of other little things in order to curb waste and improve efficiency. There was the Freedom of Information Act in 1996. And the idea was it was supposed to require federal agencies to disclose information in agency files, with some exceptions to those are requested. So like, intelligence and stuff like that, obviously you don't want to release that kind of information. And so like a good example of this was during the Clinton administration, there was an attempt to get Area 51 declassified. And so huge movement by citizens to have that actually happen. And so files were released into the general public. And so whether or not they were actually real files or not is another story, but it was one of those things that people have been, clamming for a long time, and they got it. And so, but whether or not they got the results they actually wanted, it could be another story. So quite often the Freedom of Information Act of 1996 is used for like newspapers or for the media, because the media needs to get information from government, and government likes to hold back on giving you information. And so it's used in order to force government to tell you specific information. They have a certain amount of time they have to respond. And unfortunately, in some administrations, we've had a lot of pushback because government doesn't want to reveal what government is doing. That's just the way it's always been. And so, and it doesn't matter what political party you're part of, neither side that's in power ever wants to tell anybody what's actually going on. And so, just kind of one of those things, power does what power does. And so, one of the other things we added to the whole idea of improving efficiency was called sunshine laws. And this is so if you had a government meeting, and this is really important, you couldn't have it in private, because a lot of meetings were happening in private and people had no idea what was actually going on. And decisions were being made that affected people's lives or their economies. And they had no choice in it, nor did they even know why it actually happened. So sunshine laws were designed to make sure that didn't happen any further. And so one of the problems that we ended up with is sometimes circumstances will change things and cause things to happen that weren't expected. And so a lot of changes happened to government right after the 9/11 attacks. And so when they had happened, basically government tightened tons of information, its grip on tons of information, making it really difficult to get any further information. It was all done under national security, or the guise of national security. And so since then, there's been a whole bunch of attempts to move that away, or to move away from that. But again, like I said, once it's used as a crutch, it's really, really hard to lodge it back out into the general public and make it sunshine. That's kind of how it works. So a lot of things that are happening in the future right now, or that are moving towards in the future, is government is starting to move a lot of its functions online. And that's just because you kind of have to. You can't literally have all of what's going on in the world today, and everything is global, and there's instant communication with everybody. I mean, you don't have to pick up a phone to call somebody and wait at a specific time in order to get, good rates to do it. You're constantly in touch with anybody, anywhere. And so with internet, you're instantly in communication with other people. And while this has caused some um, draconian governments to have some problems with their people because they can't maintain the control they used to want to control or maintain, uh, it serves good and bad purposes of that going forward. But one of the problems we're going to run into, and we have been running into, is a lot of e-fraud. And so, because people have a tendency of finding a really easy way to make money and to cheat other people, and people who have not had technology have a tendency of kind of giving in to a lot of things that they don't realize they aren't as safe with, because there's the expectation like paper did this, paper did that, and then they get taken advantage of. And the way, like I said, online works so fast and it's instant communication, you could lose a fortune in seconds. And so that is a huge concern going forward. And so hopefully government is starting to address that because they realize it is a problem. And so with that being said, that's pretty much bureaucracy, I'd say, in a nutshell, but that was kind of a long nutshell. So thank you.